Thank you, Madam Speaker. Permission to speak to the entire package?
Without objection, so ordered.
I rise today to support the hate crimes and institutional desecration package. And today I have a special note that my comments today are from both myself and my former Victim Services Director. Nina Simone once said, "I'll tell you what freedom is to me, no fear." Madam Speaker, only 7.2% of Americans identify as LGBTQIA, and yet, according to the Williams Institute, about 9% of all violent victimizations against LGBT people are hate crimes, compared to 4% of violent victimizations against non-LGBT people. LGBT people experience 5.4 violent hate crimes specifically motivated by sexual orientation and gender identity per 1,000 people, compared to 0.2 victimizations per 1,000 people for non-LGBT people, with transgender and gender nonconforming people experiencing the most violent cases and trans women of color disproportionately represented among hate crimes and bias incident cases. While Executive Director and Policy Director at Equality Michigan, a statewide LGBTQ advocacy organization that does public education, public policy, advocacy, and Victim Services Director Eve led our hate crimes response effort, and the whole team weathered each tragedy together. Our efforts to respond to and report hate crimes while supporting victims and our larger LGBTQ community too often left us with hands tied and justice out of reach. Despite the LGBTQIA+ communities being frequent victims of the most horrific violent crimes in our state, our lives and deaths were too often not valued enough to be properly investigated, while legal inconsistencies and narrow criteria for qualifying a crime as a hate crime kept charges from being filed in the majority of cases. It was clear from loss after loss and the lack of action that followed that the law must reflect a recognition that all have value and a right to exist. It was also clear that that very essential recognition was lacking. When we refuse to take seriously the threats to our neighbors and opt out of protecting all communities based on our own judgment of who deserves safety, we perpetuate the dehumanization of our most vulnerable friends and neighbors and make violence even more likely. In recent years, bias-motivated threats and actual violence have increased for our Black and brown residents, our places of worship and religious practitioners, and for our LGBTQIA+ community. The threat to our most vulnerable communities has correlated with a rise in unapologetic exclusion and hate speech. Just last week, the Lansing area, still reeling from the recent mass shooting at Michigan State University, was the target of another plan to take innocent lives when a plot to carry out a mass shooting at an East Lansing synagogue was thwarted by law enforcement. This legislation will not instantly stop the ever-growing rise of hate crimes against our most vulnerable communities, but it will, finally, establish a standard for the safety and respect overdue to those Michiganders dehumanized, alienated, and targeted for violence in our neighborhoods, institutions, places of worship, and our schools. With the passage of this legislation, we declare safety, dignity, and freedom from harassment as a bare minimum, regardless of, and not despite, who we are, who we love, or how we worship. And we do so while implementing best practices that show compassion and offer opportunity for reform for those who have let ignorance, lack of empathy, and fear direct their actions. All crimes are not created equal, but according to the Constitution, people are. Hate crimes are committed with the intent to harm and intimidate entire communities, as well as the individual victim, because the victim is a representation of the community. It isn't an assault, it's an assault with a broad message, an enhanced crime. The targets of hate violence are usually the most underrepresented and marginalized communities. In a free society, you are free to love, dislike, and even hate whoever you want. But you are not free to violate another's liberty because of it, and you are certainly not free from the consequences of your actions if you do. Our social contract says that you have to, at bare minimum, respect that we're all created equal. Indeed, bias and hate are different animals, and today we assert that they will not be tolerated and must be tamed for the good of all. Hate can't dominate when love, learning, acceptance, and accountability are empowered to lead the way. I will vote yes today for the many victims we worked for but could not protect. Ashton O'Hara and Amber Monroe, murders occurring just a few weeks apart near Palmer Park. Amber was shot and murdered. Ashton was stabbed and pushed out of a car and then repeatedly run over. Calvin Lipscomb, who was shot, burned, and then dumped in a trash bin. Shelley Hilliard, only 19, dressed up in a beautiful silver dress to meet a date and was instead met by two strange men who murdered her, dismembered her body, scattered pieces of her body, and then burned her torso. The taxi driver heard her cries as they drove away. Burning is not an uncommon element to an anti-LGBTQ hate crime, as the motivation behind it isn't personal to the victim, but instead a visceral reaction to wishing an entire community didn't exist. And finally, after leaving Equality Michigan, I worked on the murder of Lansing gay man Kevin Worth. Kevin's crime initially didn't receive the dignity of being recognized as a hate crime, even though the victim and assailant were strangers, and Kevin was stabbed 22 times. He was left dead in his home while the assailant lounged in his living room all night and then took a shower prior to leaving. Enough. Madam Speaker, I know what freedom is, even while we do not yet know freedom. It is not survival, nor resilience, nor courage. Freedom is, as Nina said, no fear. Please vote yes for this important legislation.